Welcome to my channel. The era of the Second and Third Crusades. The Second Crusade. Although the vulnerability of Edessa had long been known, both Eastern and Western Christians were shocked by its fall. Europe soon received urgent requests for assistance, and in 1145 Pope Eugenius III published the official Crusade bull Quantum Predecessors, which translates to, "How much our predecessors?" It was the first of its type, with carefully crafted clauses reflecting modern developments in canon law and safeguarding the families and property of Crusaders. Many unassuming pilgrims replied, just like in the First Crusade. But unlike the First Crusade, King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany led the Second Crusade, making them two of Europe's most powerful kings. While Conrad first opposed the crusade and was only persuaded by St. Bernard's persuasiveness, Louis heartily backed it. Additionally, the Second Crusade was different from the first in that it had three goals rather than just one. Other crusaders traveled to Spain to battle Muslims or to the Baltic Sea coast to fight the pagan Wends, while the monarchs of Germany and France marched east to retake Edessa. The kings of Poland and Bohemia, as well as Frederick of Swabia, Conrad's nephew, and the future Emperor Frederick I, Frederick Barbarossa, all left with him in May 1147. When Conrad's forces arrived in Constantinople in September, there was unrest due to their lack of discipline. Conrad and Manuel, on the other hand, continued to get along well, and they shared apprehension about the actions of King Roger II of Sicily, who during these same weeks had taken Corfu and was waging war on the Greek mainland. A month after the Germans, on October 4, Louis VII and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine arrived in Constantinople after traveling by land through Europe. Upon learning that Manuel had agreed to a truce with the Turks of Iconium and completely misinterpreting his intentions, a handful of his more irascible supporters accused the emperor of treachery and pushed the French king to join Roger in attacking the Byzantines. Louis pledged to return any imperial properties he might seize because he valued the advice of his less erratic advisors. The Second Crusade had been enthusiastically publicized and had inspired tremendous expectations. Its fall sparked profound shock. Saint Bernard, seeking an explanation, went to the Bible and proclaimed that Europe's depravity was the reason the crusade failed. God would only relent and grant his knights victory once more through the cleansing and prayers of Christian men and women. During the Middle Ages, this idea became a cornerstone of crusading ideology and a major driving force behind lay piety movements. The Second Crusade's failure, on the other hand, greatly inspired the Muslims because they had successfully defended themselves against the threat of yet another significant Western mission. The Crusader states to 1187. Baldwin III, reigned 1143–62, and Embark, reigned 1163–74, two of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's most capable kings, presided over the country during the 25 years that followed the Second Crusade. Although this would be the Franks' last significant conquest, King Baldwin's capture of Ascalon in 1153 allowed the kingdom to expand its coastline southward. Its possession was negated the following year by Nur al-Din's seizure of Damascus, which marked another step in the Muslim powers' encirclement of the Crusader realms. After considerable delay, the Byzantine fleet and army finally arrived in 1169, but both armies were compelled to leave due to a lack of supplies and seasonal rains. Each side blamed the other for the absence of a confrontation. Saladin followed Nur al-Din's directive in 1171 to have the prayers in the mosques refer to the Caliph of Baghdad rather than Cairo, whose health was failing. Cairo's Caliph was the one whose name was mentioned since he was in poor health. With then, the Fatimid Caliphate and the significant division in Levantine Islam came to an end, both of which the Latins had benefited from. After considerable delay, the Byzantine ship and army finally arrived in 1169. However, due to inadequate supplies and seasonal rains, both armies were forced to leave once more, with each side blaming the other for the lack of a confrontation. Saladin complied with Nur al-Din's request in 1171 to have the prayers in the mosques refer to the Caliph of Baghdad rather than Cairo, whose health was failing. The Fatimid Caliphate and the significant split in Levantine Islam, which the Latins had benefited from, came to an end at this point. Amalric's son Baldwin IV, a 13-year-old kid with leprosy, succeeded him in Jerusalem. The succession issue persisted until the young king's sister Sybil gave birth to a son, the future Baldwin V, to William of Montferrat, despite the young king's great endurance. The tension between the barons was heightened by her subsequent marriage in 1180 to Guy of Lusignan, a stranger to the east and Amalric's brother. Agnes of Courtenay, the Queen Mother, Sybil, Agnes's brother Jocelyn III of Edessa, and the Lusignans formed a sort of court party that was frequently opposed by another group, which was primarily made up of the so-called native barons, old families. In an effort to draw the Crusaders out into the open, Saladin blocked the major road to Tiberias on July 2 and dispatched a small army to attack the town. However, it was Raymond who initially convinced the king to avoid the trap. But later that evening, others convinced the monarch to reconsider after charging the count with treason. The Crusader army would be destroyed as a result of this tragic choice. On July 3, the Crusaders endured a taxing day of marching, a miserable night without water, and were constantly pursued and surrounded. The following day, they engaged Saladin's soldiers at the Horns of Anne and fought all day long in the haze produced by grass fires that the enemy had started. Saladin quickly followed up his victory in the Battle of Hattin by taking Tiberias and moving toward the coast to seize Acre, Akko. By September 1187, he and his lieutenants had occupied most of the major strongholds in the kingdom and all the ports south of Tripoli, Jubail and Botron, Al-Batron, in the county of Tripoli and Tyre in the kingdom. On October 2, Jerusalem, then defended by only a handful of men under the command of Balian of Ibelin, capitulated to Saladin, who agreed to allow the inhabitants to leave once they had paid a ransom. Meanwhile, Saladin continued his conquests in the north, and by 1189 all of the kingdom was in his hands except Beaver, modern Kokov Har-Yarden, and Tyre. The county of Tripoli and the principality of Antioch were each reduced to the capital city and a few outposts. The majority of the 100-year-old Latin establishment in the Levant had been lost. The institutions of the First Kingdom. The four Crusader principalities, three after the fall of Edessa in 1144, were indissociably linked, and in the middle of the century, the King of Jerusalem's meager suzerainty over Antioch and Tripoli essentially lost its significance. The dominant Christian minority formed each state into a system of lordships. The institutions of the Kingdom of Jerusalem are the most well-known, in part because its history is more prominently depicted in both Arab and Christian chronicles and in particular because its records were better kept. Toward the middle of the century, this situation changed. Partly as a consequence of increased immigration from the West, the baronial class grew, and a relatively small group of magnates with large domains emerged. As individuals, they were less disposed to brook royal interference, and, as a class and in the court of barons, haute cour, or high court, they were capable of presenting a formidable challenge to royal authority. The last of the kings of Jerusalem to exercise effective power was Amalric I in the 12th century. In the final years of the First Kingdom, baronial influence was increasingly evident, and dissension among the barons, as a consequence, was more serious. The military orders. The vast authority of the two religion military orders presented a significant barrier to the king's jurisdiction, which did not exist in the same manner in the West. The merchants of Amalfi formed the Knights of the Hospital of St. John, often known as the Hospitallers, to provide medical care for pilgrims in the 11th century. The organization didn't give up on its initial goals. In fact, as its incredible archive of papers shows, the order's charitable endeavors grew. However, in the 12th century, in response to the kingdom's military requirements, few Muslims were slaves. Most of those who remained were peasants who for centuries had been a large part of the rural population and who were permitted to retain their holdings. Subject to fiscal impositions not unlike those of the European serf and usually identical to those originally levied by their former proprietors on all non-Muslims. Muslim nomads, or Bedouin, who from time immemorial had moved their herds with the changing seasons, were granted the traditional rights of pasturage by the king. Most mosques were appropriated during the conquest, but some were restored, and no attempt was made to restrict Muslim religious observance. Occasionally a mihrab, prayer niche, was retained for Muslim worshippers in a church that had formerly been a mosque. The tolerance of the Franks, noted by Arab visitors, often surprised and disturbed newcomers from the West. The Third Crusade. Even before Archbishop Josias of Tyre, whom the Crusaders had dispatched with urgent pleas for assistance, arrived there, word of Jerusalem's fall had reached Europe. The sorrowful news reportedly devastated Pope Urban III, who passed sometime shortly after. Gregory VIII, who succeeded him, issued a crusade bull that urged penitence and fasting. Before a new crusade could be organized, however, a modest recovery had begun in the east. Scarcely 2 weeks after Hattin, Conrad of Montferrat, Baldwin V's uncle, had landed at Tyre with a small Italian fleet and a number of followers. he immediately established himself sufficiently to stave off an attack by Saladin. Conrad also refused to submit to King Guy when Saladin released the king at the end of 1188 as promised. The first ruler to respond to the papal appeal was William II of Sicily, who immediately abandoned a conflict with Byzantium and equipped a fleet that soon left for the east, though William himself died in November 1189. English, Danish, and Flemish ships also departed. Meanwhile, Gregory VIII had sent a legation to the Holy Roman Emperor and participant in the Second Crusade, Frederick Barbarossa, now nearly 70 years old and approaching the end of an eventful career. After Philip returned to France, he preyed upon Richard's lands. Though forbidden by the Church, these actions were lucrative nonetheless. Richard received urgent messages from home requesting his return. Meanwhile, he had been in constant communication with Saladin and his brother Al-Adil, and various peace proposals were made, which included marriage alliances. In fact, there seemed to be warm cordiality and considerable mutual respect between Richard and Saladin. The Third Crusade had failed to attain its main objective, the retaking of Jerusalem, but in every other way it was a great success. Most of Saladin's victories in the wake of Hatton were wiped away. Before he left, Richard consented to the request that Guy, who had lost the support of nearly all the barons, be deposed and Conrad immediately be accepted as king. No sooner was this done than Conrad was killed by members of the Nizari Ismailia, a movement within Shia Islam. Isabel was persuaded to marry Henry of Champagne, and Guy was given the governorship of Cyprus, where his record was far more successful than his ill-starred career in Jerusalem. Although he had failed to recapture Jerusalem, Richard had put the Christians of the Levant back on their feet. The Latin East after the Third Crusade. On March 3, 1193, Saladin passed away. This was a short time after the Third Crusade left. He was one of the greatest Muslim commanders, a man who was intensely religious and dedicated to jihad against the unbeliever, but he was nevertheless revered by his foes. When he passed away, the Muslim world became divided once more, but his Ayyubid successors were ready to maintain the truce with the Crusaders, which lasted into the first years of the 13th century. Both sides benefited politically and commercially from the ceasefire, and the Italians quickly established successful business ties in Egypt. As a result of their ability to adapt, the Franks established what amounted to a new nominal kingdom of Jerusalem, centered on Acre. Difficulties, internal conflicts among the Crusaders, and formidable Muslim resistance playing significant roles in their outcomes. These crusades also had long-term effects on European and Middle Eastern history, contributing to the cultural exchange and interactions between East and West.